In 1952, 13 men hurled Bumpy Johnson off a four-story building, certain they'd executed Harlem's untouchable kingpin. 2 hours later, 37 killers unleashed a synchronized massacre across 5 blood-soaked locations that paralyzed the NYPD. How did a dying man with shattered bones command New York's most savage retribution from a pitch-black alley? Harlem didn't whisper its secrets. It swallowed them whole. The numbers runners knew which alleys stayed dark at 3 a.m. The cops knew which precincts never got the call. The shopkeepers knew when to pull their steel gates down mid-afternoon, not because they'd been told, but because the air itself changed temperature. Fear had a smell in Harlem's stale tobacco, fresh concrete, and the metallic tang of blood that hadn't been spilled yet but would be. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to announce himself. His shadow did the talking. He moved through 125th Street like smoke through a cracked window, invisible until you choked on it. 3 blocks north, a policy banker had his kneecaps shattered with a Louisville slugger for skimming $12. The man screamed for 40 minutes before someone showed mercy with a pillow. No investigation. No witnesses. The next morning, his replacement arrived with a briefcase and a nervous smile, paid every dime to the penny, and never mentioned the predecessor whose brains were still drying on a Harlem basement floor. That was order. Bumpy's empire wasn't built on spectacle. It was carved into the bones of the city with surgical precision. When he walked into Small's paradise, conversations didn't stop. They just lowered to frequencies only dogs and desperate men could hear. Waiters moved faster. Drinks appeared without being ordered. A table in the back corner stayed empty. Not because it was reserved, but because everyone understood what happened to people who sat there uninvited. He wore his power like a well-tailored suit, quiet, expensive, and utterly unmistakable. But 40 blocks south, Hell's Kitchen was drowning in its own blood. The Westside Boys didn't understand subtlety. They were Irish hammers in a world of Italian stilettos, loud, crude, effective in the short term, catastrophic in the long. Red Malone ran them like a butcher ran a slaughterhouse, with volume, with waste, with the assumption that there would always be more meat tomorrow. His men collected protection by breaking storefront windows first and asking questions later. They expanded territory not through negotiation, but through arson. When a shopkeeper refused to pay, they didn't just beat him, they burned his store, his inventory, and sometimes his family inside it. The NYPD looked the other way. Half of them were on Malone's payroll. The other half were too terrified to cash a check. By late 1952, the Westside Boys had swallowed Hell's Kitchen whole and started eyeing the neutral zone between 57th and 61st, the razor-thin buffer that separated Malone's chaos from Bumpy's cathedral of controlled violence. It was a gentleman's agreement written in decades of cautious bloodshed. You stay in your kingdom. I stay in mine. And Manhattan doesn't turn into a war zone that brings the feds down on both our heads. But Malone didn't do agreements. He did annexation. His soldiers started appearing on 58th Street 3-man crews loitering outside bodegas, offering better rates to numbers runners, asking questions about who paid what to whom. They smiled when they talked. They cracked their knuckles when they listened. The implicit threat was carved into their faces like scars: choose us, or we'll choose for you. Harlem's response was biblical silence. No threats, no confrontations, no bodies turning up in the Hudson with concrete shoes. Bumpy's men simply existed. They stood on corners with their hands in their pockets and their eyes on the West Side crews. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just watched with the patient inevitability of guillotine blades waiting to drop. That should have been enough. In a sane world, Red Malone would have read the room, understood that Bumpy's silence wasn't weakness but the drawn breath before a scream. He would have pulled his men back, tightened his borders, and lived to expand another day in another direction. But Malone wasn't sane. He was a rabid dog who mistook Bumpy's restraint for cowardice. And in Harlem, that kind of mistake had a price written in arterial spray. The city held its breath. Shop owners started closing early. Policy runners rerouted their collections. Even the junkies in the shooting galleries felt it, that electric charge before a lightning strike. The atmospheric pressure drop before a tornado levels everything in its path. Something was coming. Harlem knew it. Hell's Kitchen knew it. The cops pretended they didn't, but their hands stayed closer to their holsters, and their patrol routes mysteriously avoided certain intersections after dark. Because when Bumpy Johnson finally moved, it wouldn't be loud. It would be absolute. And the city that knew when to look away was about to learn what happened when you forced it to watch. His name was Samuel Numbers Green, and he was about to become the match that burned Manhattan. Samuel ran policy slips for both sides of 58th Street, a dangerous balancing act that had kept him alive precisely because both Bumpy and Malone found him more useful breathing than decorating the bottom of the East River. He was 43, rail thin, with hands that never stopped shaking and eyes that never stopped calculating odds. In another life, he might have been an accountant. In this one, he was a wire stretched between two bombs, praying neither one exploded. On October 14th, 1952, his prayers ran out. The Westside Boys cornered him outside a tenement on 59th, three gorillas in cheap suits with cheaper morals. Tommy the Hammer. Corrigan did the talking, which was unfortunate because Tommy had the vocabulary of a concussed butcher and the diplomacy of a clawhammer to the skull. You're done playing both sides. Numbers. Tommy's breath smelled like rot-gut whiskey and decaying teeth. From tonight, you work for us. Exclusively. Samuel's hands trembled so violently, his policy slips almost scattered. I can't. You know I can't. Bumpy. Bumpy's got too much territory to notice one little numbers man switching sides. Tommy smiled, and it was the kind of smile that preceded fractured orbital bones. Unless you'd prefer we explain it to your wife. And your daughter. The pretty one. What's her name? Claudette. The threat hung in the air like a noose. Samuel had survived 15 years in the policy racket by reading silence the way priests read scripture. Bring your policy network with you. Give them access to Harlem's numbers. Samuel's throat went dry. How did you? I know everything that happens on that border. Samuel, I knew about the meeting 40 seconds after Tommy Corrigan opened his inbred mouth. Bumpy finally looked up, and his eyes were obsidian flat, dark, and utterly unreadable. The question is, what do you want me to do about it? This was the test. Samuel understood that immediately. If he begged for protection, Bumpy would provide it, but Samuel would owe a debt that could never be repaid. A leash that would strangle him slowly over years. If he asked Bumpy to retaliate, he'd be ordering violence he couldn't afford, painting a target on his back that Hell's Kitchen would never forget. But if he asked for the right solution, the legal one, the measured one maybe, just maybe, he'd survive this. I want to file a police report, Samuel said carefully. Official, on record. Extortion and threats against my family. Let the law handle it. For 3 endless seconds, Bumpy said nothing. Then he smiled, a thin, surgical expression that never reached his eyes. Smart. Very smart. Legal pressure. No bodies. No war. He folded his newspaper with precise, deliberate movements. Consider it done. I'll have my lawyer contact the precinct tomorrow. They'll take your statement. The Westside Boys will get a visit from some very motivated detectives. Samuel exhaled. He'd survived. He'd played it perfectly. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. One more thing, Samuel. Bumpy's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. If you ever come to me with a problem again, I won't offer you legal solutions. I'll offer you a shovel and a map to where your family's bodies are buried. Understood. Samuel nodded so hard his neck cracked. Good. Now get out. 40 blocks south. Red Malone heard about the police report and laughed until he vomited whiskey onto his office floor. He thinks cops scare us cops. Malone slammed his fist on the desk hard enough to crack the wood. That African-American thinks he can hide behind badges and bureaucracy. Tommy Corrigan, nursing a black eye from an unrelated bar fight, grinned. Want me to gut numbers like a Thanksgiving turkey? No. Malone's eyes glittered with something far worse than rage amusement. I want to send Bumpy a message he can't ignore. I want him to know that his legal games don't mean expletive west of 61st Street. What kind of message? Malone lit a cigar, the flame casting devil shadows across his scarred face. The kind that involves gravity. Chapter 3. The Invitation. The call came on October 21st, 1952 at 9:47 p.m. Bumpy's phone, a black rotary in his Harlem office, rang once. He let it ring 3 more times before answering, because a man who answers too quickly is a man who's afraid of missing something. Johnson. His voice was neutral, but his free hand already rested on the .38 snub nose in his desk drawer. Mr. Johnson. The voice on the other end was smooth, educated, a voice that didn't belong in Hell's Kitchen. My name is Victor Castellano. I represent certain business interests on the West Side. Mr. Malone would like to extend an invitation for a face-to-face discussion. Neutral ground. No weapons. No hostilities. Just 2 businessmen finding common understanding. Bumpy's silence stretched like piano wire about to snap. When? Tomorrow night. 10 p.m., the old Vanderbilt warehouse on 52nd and 11th, 4th floor. There's an office windowed. Quiet, perfect for conversation. Neutral ground means I bring my own security. Of course, 3 men maximum. Mr. Malone will bring the same. Bumpy's fingers drummed once against the desk, his only tell. Every instinct screamed trap. But refusing the meeting would signal weakness, and in their world, weakness was a death sentence delivered in installments. I'll be there. Excellent, mister. Malone looks forward to... Bumpy hung up mid-sentence. Pleasantries were for people who trusted each other. He trusted Red Malone about as far as he could throw a Cadillac. The Vanderbilt warehouse was a concrete mausoleum, 4 stories of rusted iron and shattered windows, where legitimate business went to die. It had been abandoned since the war, a perfect no-man's land between territories. Neutral ground. Technically, also the perfect place to dispose of a body. Bumpy arrived at 9:53 p.m. with 3 of his best Marcus Knuckles Washington, 220 pounds of scar tissue and loyalty. Jerome Price, the fastest knife hand in Harlem, and William St. Patterson, who'd killed 7 men and prayed for each one afterward. They climbed the external fire escape, rusted metal, groaning under their weight to the 4th floor. The door hung open, inviting. Too inviting. Marcus went first, his hand hovering near his empty holster. No weapons. As promised. Just fists, knives, and the knowledge that they were walking into a slaughterhouse dressed as a boardroom. The office was exactly as described, spacious woo. Windowed on 3 sides, a single conference table in the center. Red Malone sat at one end, flanked by 2 enforcers. He smiled when Bumpy entered, a wolf's smile, all teeth and appetite. Mr. Johnson, glad you could make it. Bumpy said nothing. He simply walked to the opposite end of the table, his 3 men fanning out behind him. 7 men total, 4 of them about to die. The 8th through 20th men stepped out of the shadows. They'd been waiting in the adjoining rooms behind false walls, inside storage closets, beneath dust-covered tarps. 13 killers in total, each one armed with brass knuckles, lead pipes, and the kind of hate that turned men into monsters. The windows weren't for light. They were one-way glass observation posts for executioners. Marcus lunged for the door. 2 Westside goons slammed it shut, iron bolt sliding home with the finality of a coffin lid. "No weapons," Malone repeated, standing slowly. "I kept my word, but I never said anything about numbers." Bumpy's face remained carved granite. No fear, no surprise, just cold, calculating assessment. "You're making a mistake, Malone. The only mistake was yours thinking paperwork and cops could stop what's coming." Malone nodded to his men. "We're not here to negotiate. We're here to cut the head off Harlem and watch the body bleed out." The first pipe came down on Jerome's shoulder, shattering his clavicle with a wet crack. Saint threw a punch that broke one man's jaw, but 3 more grabbed his arms and slammed him face first into the concrete floor. Marcus got his hands around one throat before 4 men dogpiled him, fists raining down like meteorites. Bumpy didn't run, didn't beg, didn't plead. He simply stared at Red Malone with the infinite patience of a man who'd already written the epilogue. 2 hours, Bumpy said quietly. Even as hands grabbed his arms. "That's all you've got. 2 hours until what?" Bumpy smiled, a terrible, knowing smile that made Malone's blood run cold, for reasons he couldn't articulate. "Until Harlem reminds you why we don't need to be loud." They beat him methodically, professionally. Ribs cracked like kindling. Knuckles split his lips. A pipe to the knee dropped him screaming. But they avoided the head. Malone wanted him conscious for the finale. When Bumpy could no longer stand, they dragged him to the window. The city sprawled below neon and darkness, sirens and silence. A million people pretending they didn't know what was about to happen. "Any last words?" Malone asked. Bumpy spat blood onto Malone's shoe. "Yeah. Remember his name was Bumpy Johnson, the man you couldn't kill with gravity." They threw him. 4 stories, 48 feet, 1.7 seconds of freefall before his body hit the alley pavement with a sound like a sledgehammer hitting raw meat. Red Malone looked down at the crumpled form below, legs bent at obscene angles, blood pooling black under the streetlight. "Get rid of the others," he ordered. "Dumping in the Hudson. No traces." His men nodded, already dragging the 3 corpses toward the freight elevator. Malone took one last look at Bumpy's broken body. Harlem's ours now. He turned and walked away, never noticing the shallow rise and fall of Bumpy's chest, or the fact that, in the darkness, Bumpy's hand had already crawled 6 inches toward the alley phone booth. 1.7 seconds. That's how long it takes a human body to drop 4 stories and meet concrete at terminal velocity. Bumpy Johnson experienced every millisecond with the clarity of a man watching his own execution in slow motion. The first 0.3 seconds, his stomach lurched into his throat, bile rising, the animal brain shrieking that the world had inverted and death was accelerating toward him at 32 feet per second squared. The next 0.6 seconds even in freefall. Bumpy's mind calculated. 48 feet. Impact velocity 35 miles per hour. Kinetic force equivalent to a Buick hitting a brick wall. Survival probability if he landed skull first 0. If he landed on his legs and spine, maybe 20% if the gods were drunk and feeling generous. The final 0.8 seconds acceptance. Not of death. Never of death. But of the mathematics of violence. His body was about to become meat and broken architecture. and whether he survived the next heartbeat would determine whether Harlem drowned in blood tonight. He twisted mid-air. Not dramatically. There wasn't time for theater. Just a slight hip rotation, angling his body so his legs would take the brunt. Better shattered femurs than a severed spinal cord. Better crippled than dead. Better breathing than buried. He hit the alley pavement like a meteor made of bone and spite. Crack. Both legs exploded. His femurs snapped like dry kindling, jagged bone punching through muscle and skin. His tibias shattered into ivory splinters. His left kneecap disintegrated into fragments that would never be whole again. The sound was wet and final, like a butcher's cleaver hitting a side of beef, flesh and bone becoming one with concrete in a marriage consummated by gravity. His ribs, already fractured from the beating, compressed like a vice closing. Two more snapped clean through. One punctured his left lung. Air hissed out of his chest cavity, blood filling the space where oxygen belonged. Each attempted breath became drowning on dry land. His head whiplashed backward, skull cracked against pavement. White light detonated behind his eyes, then black, then white again, strobing between consciousness and the void that promised peace. If he'd just stopped fighting and let go. He didn't let go. Above him, 4 stories up, Red Malone's silhouette appeared in the window, a shadow puppet framed by industrial light, watching his handiwork. Satisfied, already mentally carving up Harlem's territory like a conquistador, dividing a fresh corpse of a continent. The shadow disappeared. Bumpy lay in the alley, a broken puppet with severed strings. Blood pooled beneath him, dark arterial red mixing with rainwater and motor oil and rat piss. His legs bent at angles that defied human anatomy, bones jutting through torn fabric like broken fence posts. His breathing shallow, wet, rattling, the sound of a man with one foot in the grave and the other in a wood chipper. Any rational observer would call the morgue. But Bumpy Johnson had built an empire on being categorically irrational. His right hand, the only part of his body still accepting commands from his brain, scraped across concrete, fingernails tearing off, skin shredding like wet paper, inch by agonizing inch. He dragged himself toward the phone booth 10 feet away. 10 feet might as well have been 10 miles across broken glass while being set on fire. Every movement was negotiating with death and telling death to wait its turn. His shattered leg screamed electric agony up his spine. His punctured lung whistled and gurgled. His vision swam between clarity and blackout. Somewhere in his fractured ribcage, bone shards ground against each other like broken bottles in a cement mixer. But he crawled, because Red Malone had made one catastrophic miscalculation that would cost him everything. He'd assumed Bumpy Johnson's power lived in his body, that breaking the man would shatter the empire, that gravity could assassinate a kingdom. He was cosmically, fatally wrong. Bumpy's power lived in the 37 men scattered across Harlem who would baptize Manhattan in gasoline and light the match if he whispered the word. It lived in the network of policy runners, enforcers, and stone-cold killers who understood their survival was chained to his. It lived in 2 decades of infrastructure, controlled violence, and the kind of loyalty you can't buy, only earned through rivers of spilled blood. And he still had a voice, 5 feet from the phone booth. His hand slipped in his own blood, a crimson oil slick spreading beneath him. He fell. Face hit concrete, teeth cracked like porcelain. He tasted copper and bone fragments and the metallic promise of his own mortality. He kept crawling, 3 feet. His vision tunneled, edges going black, peripheral awareness dying, his body screaming at him to stop, to rest, to die with dignity instead of dying like a dog in an alley. He told his body to shut up and keep moving. 1 foot. His hand touched the phone booth's base. Cold metal. Salvation 4 feet up. Impossible. His legs were ruined matchsticks, his ribs shattered pottery. He couldn't stand. So he didn't stand. He climbed, using the booth's metal frame like a ladder. He hauled his broken carcass upward, every inch purchased with screaming agony. His left leg dangled uselessly, bone jutting through torn fabric like a compound fracture in a medical textbook. His right hand gripped, his left hand pulled, his core, held together by spite and willpower, and the refusal to give Red Malone the satisfaction. Contracted. 30 seconds of climbing through hell. His hand closed around the phone receiver. He fed a dime into the slot with fingers that had lost all sensation. Dialed a number burned into his memory 15 years ago. The number that activated the fail-safe. The dead man's switch. The protocol that said, if you're hearing this, I'm in the ground or close enough. Burn everything that moves. The phone rang once. Yeah. The voice was gravel and cigarettes and barely restrained violence. Marcus the Ox Freeman, Bumpy's second in command. A man who'd killed his first person at 14 with a broken bottle and never developed a conscience about it. Bumpy's voice came out as a wet whisper, barely audible over static and his own dying. Red Malone. Vanderbilt warehouse. Through me. I'm still breathing. Silence on the other end, not confusion. Pure calculation, the sound of a war being planned in real time. How long? Marcus asked. 2 hours. Another pause, shorter, colder. Understood. The line went dead. Bumpy let the receiver fall. It swung on its cord, tapping against metal like a metronome counting down to the apocalypse. He slumped against the phone booth, consciousness fading like a candle in a hurricane. His breathing shallow, his pulse thready, his body shutting down. Organ by organ, system by system. But he was smiling through broken teeth and blood, because Red Malone had just committed suicide and didn't know it yet. He'd left Bumpy Johnson alive long enough to give the order. And in Harlem. Orders didn't need repetition or explanation. They needed execution. 4 stories above, Red Malone poured himself whiskey, convinced he'd just conquered a kingdom. 10 feet below, Bumpy Johnson bled out in an alley, convinced he'd just sentenced an entire city to holy war. Both men were right. The clock started ticking. The alley swallowed Bumpy whole like a throat lined with broken glass and rat shit. No streetlights penetrated this deep. No windows overlooked this trash-choked corridor between buildings where the city threw away everything it didn't want to acknowledge. This was where junkies overdosed in pools of their own vomit, where prostitutes got strangled with piano wire and left to rot for 3 days before anyone noticed the smell, where nobody called the cops because in Hell's Kitchen, calling the cops was how you became the next body under a tarp. Bumpy Johnson lay crumpled against the phone booth like garbage that hadn't been collected yet. His consciousness flickering between lucidity and the black void that whispered sweet promises of peace if he'd just stop fighting and embrace the nothing. He told the void to go fuck itself. His breathing came in wet, rattling gasps that sounded like someone gargling broken glass and blood. The punctured lung filling milliliter by milliliter. Each inhale white-hot agony. Each exhale drowning in his own fluids. His shattered legs had gone mercifully numb. Shock's small kindness before the entire system crashes and the lights go out forever. His vision swam with dark spots that multiplied like cancer cells, metastasizing across his retinas. Time became meaningless. Minutes stretched into geological epochs, or maybe just seconds. He couldn't tell anymore. Reality was negotiable when you were dying. Somewhere in the urban distance, sirens wailing like mechanical banshees. But they weren't coming here. They never came here. This alley was off the map, outside jurisdiction, in the cracks where civilization pretended not to look. His mind started drifting toward the morphine haze of dying, that warm, comfortable surrender. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Multiple sets. Combat boots on wet concrete. The rhythm of men who'd marched through worse than this. Bumpy's eyes cracked open. 3 silhouettes materialized from the darkness like demons, summoned by arterial spray and whispered prayers to violent gods. For one terrible moment, he thought Malone's men had returned to finish what gravity started. Then he recognized the lead figure's gait, that unmistakable rolling walk of controlled brutality. Marcus the Ox. Freeman moved like a freight train given human form and taught to hate. 6'4", 280 pounds of scar tissue and unshakable loyalty forged in knife fights and back alley executions. Behind him, 2 field medics carrying a stretcher and a medical kit that looked like it belonged in a Korean war MASH unit. Not a back alley extraction in Manhattan. No ambulance. No hospital. No official record that Bumpy Johnson still had a pulse. Because if word leaked that he survived, Malone would mobilize every killer in Hell's Kitchen to correct that error. And this time, they'd make sure with bullets instead of gravity. Marcus knelt beside Bumpy, his face carved from granite and bad intentions. No emotion, no reaction to the broken meat puppet in front of him. He'd seen worse, done worse, been worse. How bad? Marcus's voice was flat as a gravestone. Legs are scrap metal, ribs are shrapnel, lungs got a hole. 2 hours, 5 locations, simultaneous. Bumpy's words came out as bloody bubbles that popped against his lips. Marcus nodded once, understanding immediate and absolute and murderous. Names, Kya. Bumpy rattled off 5 addresses in Hell's Kitchen. Westside Boys strongholds, the infrastructure keeping Malone's operation breathing. Then 5 names. Tommy the Hammer Corrigan, Victor Castellano, the 13 enforcers who'd beaten him like a government mule, and Red Malone himself, the architect of this monumental mistake. No survivors, erase them from existence. Bumpy's voice was fading, but the intent was diamond hard. Consider it already done. Marcus turned to the medics. Get him to Doc Sullivan's, back entrance. 0 witnesses. Anyone sees anything. They don't anymore. The medics moved with military efficiency born from stitching up bullet wounds in basements, while police sirens wailed 3 blocks over. They cut away Bumpy's shredded pants, revealing compound fractures where bone punched through skin like prison shanks. One medic injected morphine directly into Bumpy's thigh, enough to kill a horse or make a dying man functional for another hour. The other wrapped his torso in compression bandages to stabilize the punctured lung and keep his ribs from turning his internal organs into hamburger. This is going to hurt worse than the fall, the medic warned. Bumpy almost laughed. Everything already hurt. Pain had become his entire universe, the only thing keeping him anchored to consciousness. They lifted him onto the stretcher. His shattered legs shifted. Bone ground against bone with sounds that would haunt the medic's dreams for years. The morphine dulled the edges but couldn't erase the fundamental reality that his body was now a jigsaw puzzle held together by gauze, spite, and the biological imperative to not give his enemies the satisfaction. As they carried him toward the waiting car, a black Cadillac with tinted windows and no plates, and the kind of anonymous menace that made pedestrians cross the street. Bumpy grabbed Marcus's sleeve with fingers that barely had grip strength left. 2 hours, he repeated, voice fading into chemical darkness. Not 1 second longer. Marcus checked his watch. 10:47 p.m. There'll be corpses by 12:47. My word. Bumpy's grip loosened, consciousness slipping away like water through broken fingers. The morphine pulling him down into chemical oblivion where pain couldn't follow. But before the void claimed him completely, He whispered one final instruction. Make it biblical. Old Testament. Plagues and pillars of salt. Marcus smiled, a terrible expression that never touched his eyes. With pleasure. The call went out at 10:52 p.m. through channels that didn't officially exist. Not through phones, not through written messages, through the invisible network of runners, enforcers, and ghosts that formed Harlem's shadow government. The real power structure that made politicians and police commissioners look like children playing dress-up. Within 7 minutes, 37 men knew exactly what needed to happen and how and when and what tools would be required. No questions asked, no confirmation needed, no debate or discussion. The summons was absolute as gravity. At 11:03 p.m., weapons began manifesting across Harlem like stigmata, bleeding out of false-bottomed pianos and hollow brick walls and spaces beneath church altar floors, where God apparently looked the other way. Thompson's submachine guns, sawed-off shotguns, Colt .45 revolvers, brass knuckles, meat cleavers, ice picks, straight razors, Molotov cocktails. The kind of arsenal that turned ordinary men into angels of death and streets into rivers running red. Marcus Freeman orchestrated from a Harlem pool hall. The back room converted into a war room where violence was planned with the precision of a Swiss watch. A map of Hell's Kitchen spread across the felt table. 5 locations circled in red marker like targets on an autopsy diagram. Target 1, Malone's policy operation on 48th Street. 3-story brownstone. 4 guards rotating shifts. Cash vault in the basement containing the week's take. Burn it all. Target 2. The Westside Boys weapons cache on 51st, former butcher shop, which was grimly appropriate. Steel reinforced door. 6 enforcers on rotation. Take the weapons or destroy them. Kill everyone inside. Target 3. Victor Castellanos' apartment on 54th, 4th floor walk-up, where the neutral ground invitation originated. Make an example that can't be misunderstood. Target 4. Tommy Corrigan's bar on 49th, the Hammer's headquarters where he conducted business with pipe wrenches and bathtubs full of lye. Poetic justice was on the menu. Target 5. The Vanderbilt warehouse, where 13 men beat Bumpy Johnson and threw him out a window like garbage. Special treatment reserved. Red Malone's current location remained unknown, but Marcus had sources embedded deep. By 11:30 he'd have an address, a floor number, and a body count. The 37 soldiers divided into 5 teams, 7 or 8 men per target, armed to the teeth. Synchronized down to the second. No mistakes, no survivors, no witnesses, no mercy, no hesitation, no conscience. This wasn't revenge. Revenge implied emotion, heat, passion. This was extermination. Across Harlem, civilians felt the atmospheric shift like animals before an earthquake. At 11:15 p.m., shop owners started pulling steel gates down 3 hours before normal closing. No announcement, no explanation. They just knew the way prey animals know when predators are moving. The air tasted like cordite and copper. The street lights seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper and hungrier. Mothers pulled children inside, locked doors, closed curtains, turned off lights, warned them in harsh whispers to stay away from windows and don't ask questions, and pray to whatever God still listened to this God-forsaken neighborhood. The junkies in the shooting galleries abandoned their needles mid-high, survival instinct overpowering heroin cravings, and fled to whatever holes they crawled into when the wolves came out. Prostitutes vanished from corners. Even the stray dogs went silent, tails tucked, hiding under parked cars. By 11:30 p.m., entire city blocks went dark, not from power outages, from collective understanding that breathing too loud tonight might be fatal. Harlem was holding its breath before the scream, The way you hold your breath underwater hoping the shark swims past. At 11:45 p.m., a phone rang in the 32nd precinct. The desk sergeant, a 22-year veteran who'd learned when to look the other way and when to aggressively develop selective blindness, picked up. 32nd precinct. Silence on the other end. Not empty silence. Pregnant silence. Threatening silence. Then a voice. Low and certain as a death sentence. Stay inside tonight. All units. No patrols west of 9th Avenue between 47th and 61st. What happens in the next 90 minutes doesn't concern the NYPD. Interfere and we'll make it concern you personally. Who the hell is this? The line went dead with a click that sounded like a cocking pistol. The sergeant stared at the receiver. He should have dismissed it as a crank call. Should have laughed. Should have ignored protocol violations and anonymous threats. Instead, he picked up the radio with hands that shook slightly. All units. This is dispatch. Code 10-7. Return to precinct. Effective immediately. Dispatch, we're mid-patrol. We've got a 1031 in progress and... Did I fucking stutter? Return to precinct now. Radio silence until further notice. 15 minutes later, every NYPD patrol car west of 9th Avenue had mysteriously evaporated. Radio silence, as if the entire police department had been raptured or developed sudden collective amnesia about their jurisdiction. Hell's Kitchen was about to learn what happens when the law abandons you to your enemies, and those enemies have been counting grievances for months. At 12:15 a.m., Marcus Freeman received final confirmation. Red Malone was at his mistress's apartment on 53rd Street, 5th floor. 2 bodyguards who thought they were intimidating. They weren't. Marcus smiled, a terrible expression that made grown men reconsider their life choices. He made one phone call, 6 words that would echo through Manhattan's underworld for decades. All teams, execute at 12:45 precisely. Then he hung up and checked his pistol. A Colt .45 that had killed 11 men and was about to reach an even dozen if there was any justice in this fallen world. Outside, Harlem remained dark and silent and waiting. Not the silence of sleep. The silence of predators in tall grass, muscles coiled, waiting for the signal to feed. At exactly 12:45 a.m., Hell's Kitchen detonated like a bomb made of flesh and hatred. Target 1, 48th Street Policy House. The Molotov cocktail hit the brownstone's first-floor window at 12:45 and 3 seconds. Glass shattered into glittering rain. Gasoline ignited into a blooming fireball. The curtains became a waterfall of flame that climbed walls like liquid napalm with ambition and appetite. The 4 Westside guards inside had exactly 8 seconds to realize they were about to burn alive, and there was no exit strategy. The front door exploded inward, kicked off hinges by a boot attached to 240 pounds of motivated violence. 7 Harlem enforcers flooded through the opening like water through a burst dam, carrying shotguns, revolvers, and the kind of cold efficiency that turned slaughter into assembly line work. Guard 1 reached for his weapon. A shotgun blast removed his face from his skull at point-blank range. Bone and brain matter spraying across policy slips stacked on the table like grotesque confetti. His body hit the floor, still twitching, fingers clawing at a face that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Guard 2 made it 3 steps toward the back exit before a .45 caliber round punched through his spine, severing his spinal cord and turning his legs into decorative meat. He collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, paralyzed from the waist down but fully conscious, screaming in perfect clarity as flames crawled up his useless legs and began cooking him from the feet up like a human candle. Guard 3 tried to surrender, hands raised, begging in broken English and fluent terror. They shot him in both kneecaps, point blank, shattering patella into bone fragments and severed tendons into bloody spaghetti. He fell howling. They let him howl for 40 seconds, long enough for the lesson to sink in. Long enough for everyone to understand what mercy looked like in Harlem tonight. Then they shot him in the throat. Not the head where death comes quick, the throat. So he could spend his last 90 seconds drowning in his own blood while the fire crept closer, and his body understood it was dying 2 ways simultaneously. Guard 4 was smarter or more cowardly, depending on perspective. He jumped out the back window, fell 2 stories. Both ankles shattered on impact like dropped porcelain. He was crawling toward the alley exit, leaving a blood trail like a wounded animal, when they found him. They dragged him back inside the burning building, held him down while flames ate his legs, melting skin like candle wax, turning muscle into charcoal. His screams lasted 4 minutes before smoke inhalation finally showed the mercy his killers wouldn't. The cash vault in the basement. They didn't touch it, didn't steal a single dollar. This wasn't about money. They were undertakers, not thieves. By 12:51, the brownstone was a funeral pyre visible from 6 blocks away. Black smoke rising like a signal flare, announcing the New World Order. Target 2, 51st Street weapons cache. The steel door should have been impenetrable, should have required cutting torches and 30 minutes of sustained work. Should have. They used thermite, military-grade incendiary that burned at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and laughed at concepts like fireproof and secure. The lock melted like butter under a blowtorch. The door sagged open, glowing cherry red. 6 Westside enforcers waited inside with shotguns and fantasies about last stands and going down fighting. Reality was less cinematic. The first Harlem soldier through the door took a shotgun blast to the chest. Body armor absorbed most of it, but 3 pellets punched through, shredding his left lung into hamburger. He dropped gurgling blood. Didn't matter. 7 more came behind him like a tidal wave of violence. The firefight lasted 19 seconds. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in everyone's ears faded, all 6 Westside enforcers were decorating the walls. One had his throat slit ear to ear, head nearly severed, held on only by spine and trachea. 2 were shot so many times their bodies looked like Swiss cheese. 47 entry wounds between them, more holes than flesh. Another was beaten to death with his own shotgun after it jammed at exactly the wrong moment. Skull caved in until face became abstract art. The last 2 tried to escape through the back. Survival instinct, overriding loyalty. They made it to the alley before Harlem's men caught them. They used ice picks. Slowly, methodically, puncturing kidneys, livers, lungs, avoiding major arteries to prolong the education. The screams echoed off brick walls for 6 minutes before someone finally showed mercy with a meat cleaver to the base of the skull, severing brainstem from spinal cord. The weapons cache was burned, not looted, not redistributed, burned until metal melted and wood became ash. Harlem wasn't there to arm itself. It was there to disarm Hell's Kitchen permanently and violently. Target 3, Victor Castellano's apartment. They didn't knock. The door exploded inward. Breaching charge. Probably military surplus from someone's cousin who'd done a tour in Korea and brought back party favors. Victor was in bed with his mistress when Harlem came through like the wrath of a particularly vindictive god. His mistress was smart. She screamed once, then ran to the corner and covered her head and made herself small. They ignored her completely. This wasn't about her. She was scenery. Victor reached for the revolver on his nightstand. Muscle memory from 20 years of sleeping with one eye open. They broke 4 of his fingers with a ball-peen hammer before he could touch it, bones snapping like pretzel sticks. Then they dragged him, naked, bleeding, begging in Italian and English and any language that might generate mercy. To the living room. "You made the call," Marcus Freeman said quietly, sitting in Victor's favorite chair like he owned it, which in a sense he now did. "The neutral ground invitation. Your voice, your words, your responsibility. I was just following orders Malone told me to." Marcus held up one hand. Victor went silent like a switch had been flipped. "I believe you. Which is why you get a choice most men don't." Victor's eyes widened, hope blooming like a poisonous flower. Stupid, desperate hope. "You can die fast." Marcus gestured to the revolver on the table. "Or you can die slow." He gestured to the meat hooks and blowtorch his men were unpacking from a duffel bag like twisted Christmas presents. Victor stared at both options, his hands shaking violently enough to count as a seizure, his naked body trembling. He chose the gun because he wasn't completely stupid. Marcus handed it to him. "Temple or mouth, your call. Make it quick or we make it long." Victor put the barrel in his mouth. Hesitated, tasted gun oil and his own mortality. "Do it," Marcus said conversationally, "or we do it for you the other way, and it takes 3 hours." Victor pulled the trigger. The back of his skull exited through the living room wall in a spray of brain matter and bone fragments that decorated the wallpaper like avant-garde art. His body slumped sideways, nervous system still firing, legs kicking reflexively. The mistress was still screaming in the corner. "Go home," Marcus told her without looking. "Forget this address. Forget his name. Forget you were ever born. If I hear you talked, you'll wish Victor had better aim with that pistol." She ran, barefoot, still in her nightgown, down 4 flights of stairs fast enough to sprain an ankle. She never spoke about that night again. Not to police, not to priests, not to therapists, not even to herself in the 3 a.m. hours when insomnia and guilt tag teamed her consciousness. Some silences are bought with blood. Others are gifted by terror so pure it rewires neural pathways. Target 4. Tommy Corrigan's bar. Tommy. The hammer was drunk when they came. Not falling down drunk, but fighting drunk. The kind of drunk where you're absolutely convinced you're invincible because you've won 30 bar fights and shattered 17 skulls and can't imagine the universe having other plans. He was catastrophically wrong. They came through front and back simultaneously. 8 men total, armed with shotguns and the kind of casual brutality that Tommy had built his reputation on. Karma was a vindictive bitch with perfect timing. Tommy grabbed his signature weapon, the pipe wrench he'd used to destroy 17 men's skulls and 4 women's faces, and charged like a bull with more testosterone than tactical awareness. They shot him in both kneecaps. He dropped screaming, the pipe wrench clattering away across beer-stained floorboards. Then they beat him to death with it, not quickly, methodically, breaking every bone in his body in ascending order of importance, starting with fingers, then wrists, then elbows, then shoulders, working their way up his body like they were following an anatomical checklist. His skull was the last thing they shattered. 18 blows with the wrench before it finally caved in, and his screaming stopped and his brains leaked out onto the floor he'd mopped with other people's blood for 15 years. The bar's 4 patrons were given a simple choice: leave now and never speak of this, or join Tommy in whatever hell awaits men who live by violence. All 4 left, running. One of them pissed himself in transit. By 12:58 a.m., the bar was empty except for Tommy's corpse and the pipe wrench buried in what used to be his face. Target 5. Vanderbilt Warehouse. Red Malone. Red Malone heard the sirens and knew with crystalline certainty that his empire was being erased in real time. He was in his mistress's apartment when the reports started flooding in through panicked phone calls. 5 locations. Simultaneous hits. His entire operation dismantled in 13 minutes like a house of cards in a hurricane. He tried to run, survival instinct overriding pride. Marcus Freeman was waiting at the building's exit like death keeping an appointment. Going somewhere. Malone pulled a .38 revolver. Marcus was faster, had been faster his entire life. Would be faster at his own funeral. 2 shots, both kneecaps, precision targeting. Malone collapsed, howling. They dragged him back to the Vanderbilt warehouse, up 4 flights of stairs. His shattered legs leaving blood trails on every step. 4th floor. Same window they'd thrown Bumpy Johnson from 6 hours earlier. "Please," Malone begged, pride finally broken. "I'll leave Manhattan. I'll disappear. I'll give you everything. Money. Connections. Bumpy Johnson sends his regards from the alley where you left him to die. They threw him out the same window, but unlike Bumpy Johnson. Red Malone didn't have 1.7 seconds to make peace with gravity. His body hit the pavement at 1:03 a.m., skull shattered on impact like a dropped watermelon. Brain matter decorated concrete like modern art in shades of red and gray. Death was instant and absolute and final. Marcus looked down at the corpse 4 stories below, lit a cigarette, and checked his watch. 1:04 a.m. 19 minutes total. 5 locations. 27 Westside Boys erased from existence. Malone's empire turned to ash and screaming. He walked to a payphone and dialed. "It's done." On the other end, from a makeshift operating room in Harlem where Doc Sullivan was setting bones that would never heal quite right. Bumpy Johnson, morphine sedated, legs in traction, barely clinging to consciousness, smiled through broken teeth. Good. Then he passed out. By 1:15 a.m., the NYPD returned to patrol like nothing had happened, like they'd just been on extended coffee break. They found bodies, wreckage, blood, shell casings, evidence of warfare. No witnesses, no suspects, no leads. No cooperation from civilians who suddenly developed selective amnesia about the entire evening. Just silence. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. Harlem had spoken. Hell's Kitchen had listened. And everyone else had learned when to look away. Dawn broke over Manhattan like a hangover made of guilt and gunpowder. At 6:47 a.m., the first patrol car rolled onto 48th Street and found the brownstone still smoldering. Black smoke rising into a sky that looked like it wanted nothing to do with what happened below. The officer, a rookie named Patterson who'd been on the force for exactly 11 days, vomited twice before he could radio it in. "Dispatch, we've got... Jesus Christ. We've got multiple casualties. Fire. Bodies. Send everyone." By 7:15 a.m. 5 crime scenes were swarming with police, fire departments, and detectives who'd seen everything in 20 years on the force and were now questioning that assumption. The 48th Street Policy House was a charred skeleton. 4 bodies inside, burned beyond recognition. Dental records the only hope for identification. The medical examiner would later note in his report, hands shaking as he typed, that 2 of the victims had been shot before the fire. 1 had been shot during, and the 4th had been alive when the flames consumed him, smoke in his lungs, terror frozen in whatever remained of his face. The 51st Street weapons cache looked like a war zone. 6 bodies, 47 bullet wounds total. 1 decapitated so thoroughly the head was found 15 feet from the body. Another beaten so savagely his skull had collapsed inward like a crushed beer can. Blood pooled so deep it seeped through floorboards into the butcher shop below, dripping from the ceiling like some biblical plague. Victor Castellanos' apartment on 54th was the cleanest scene, which somehow made it worse. 1 body, Single gunshot wound. Suicide. Technically. Except for the 4 broken fingers on his right hand that suggested the suicide had been strongly encouraged. His mistress was found 6 blocks away, catatonic, wrapped in a blanket, refusing to speak. She would never speak about that night. Not to police, not to prosecutors, not under oath. Her silence was absolute as death. Tommy Corrigan's bar was a slaughterhouse. His body was the centerpiece, skull caved in by his own pipe wrench in what the detectives darkly noted was poetic fucking justice. 18 separate impact points. The killer or killers had taken their time, made it educational, turned murder into a masterclass in brutality. The Vanderbilt warehouse offered the finale. Red Malone, spread across the pavement like a Rorschach test made of bone and brain matter. Cause of death, blunt force trauma from a 4-story fall. Time of death approximately 1:03 a.m. Witnesses 0. Suspects the entire population of Harlem. Apparently. By 9 a.m., the press arrived like vultures to a fresh corpse. Daily News. Bloodbath in Hell's Kitchen. 27. Dead in coordinated gang war. New York Times. Unprecedented violence erupts overnight. Police baffled. Post-Manhattan massacre worst night of gang violence in city history. The photographs were visceral. Burned bodies, blood-soaked streets, chalk outlines that looked like abstract art. Red Malone's corpse under a white sheet, brain matter still visible on concrete. Captain Frank Morrison of the 32nd Precinct held a press conference at 11 a.m. looking like a man who'd aged 15 years overnight. We are pursuing all leads. We believe this was a coordinated attack between rival organizations. We will bring those responsible to justice. The reporters shouted questions like bullets. Who ordered the hits? Was this retaliation? Do you have any suspects? Are there witnesses? Morrison's jaw tightened. The investigation is ongoing. That's all I can say at this time. Translation: we have nothing. 0. Less than 0. Because the truth was simpler and more terrifying than any conspiracy theory the press could manufacture. Harlem had gone to war for exactly 19 minutes, executed 27 men with surgical precision, then vanished like smoke, leaving behind only corpses and questions that would never be answered. The detectives canvassed neighborhoods for 3 days straight, knocked on 200 doors, interviewed 400 people, showed photographs, offered immunity, threatened obstruction charges. The response was universal. I didn't see nothing. I didn't hear nothing. I don't know nothing. Not defiance, not hostility, just flat, absolute refusal to remember anything about the night of October 21st, 1952. Old women who sat on stoops watching the street like hawks suddenly developed amnesia. Shopkeepers who knew every face in their neighborhood became face blind. Even the junkies, who'd sell their grandmother for their next fix, refused to talk, despite offers of cash and dropped charges. Harlem had collectively decided that memory was optional. One detective, a 20-year veteran named Sullivan who'd broken mob cases that sent 50 men to prison, sat in his car on 125th Street at 2 a.m. 3 days after the massacre, smoking his 4th cigarette in an hour, and finally understood. This wasn't about fear. Fear made people nervous, twitchy, looking over shoulders. This was about loyalty, about understanding that Bumpy Johnson had done what needed doing, and if you lived in Harlem, if you benefited from the order he maintained, you kept your mouth shut and your eyes forward, and you let the dead bury the dead. He crushed his cigarette in the ashtray and drove back to the precinct. "We got anything?" his partner asked. "Nothing. We're never going to get anything." "What do we tell the captain?" Sullivan lit another cigarette. "Tell him it was a professional job. Tell him the suspects are likely deceased themselves. Tell him to close the case and move on because we're chasing ghosts. By November 1st, the investigation quietly died. Not officially closed, but shelved in that special category reserved for cases everyone knows will never be solved. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The bodies were buried or cremated. The crime scenes were cleaned. The blood washed away with industrial bleach and rainwater. But Harlem remembered, and Hell's Kitchen learned. The lesson was simple, written in blood and burned into collective memory. There are boundaries you don't cross, powers you don't challenge, men you don't throw out of windows and expect to walk away from. Because some men don't die when you kill them. They multiply. 6 weeks after the massacre, Bumpy Johnson walked into Small's Paradise on 135th Street at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, leaning on a hand-carved mahogany cane that had probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The entire club went silent. Not dramatically, not obviously, but conversations lowered to whispers. Eyes tracked his movement. A table in the back corner emptied within 30 seconds. Patrons suddenly remembering urgent appointments elsewhere. Bumpy walked slowly, deliberately, each step a negotiation between will and shattered anatomy. His legs had been rebuilt with steel pins and surgical screws. His ribs had healed crooked, giving him a permanent slight hunch that somehow made him more menacing. Not less. His face bore new scars, thin white lines that mapped the beating like a topographical chart of violence survived. He looked like a man who'd been killed and decided to come back out of spite. He sat at his usual table. A waiter appeared instantly with his usual drink. Bourbon neat, hand shaking slightly as he set it down. Bumpy didn't acknowledge the drink, didn't acknowledge the waiter, didn't acknowledge the silent attention focused on him like a spotlight made of fear and respect. He simply sat, watching. Present. The message was clear without being spoken. I'm still here. I'm still breathing. And the men who tried to change that are fertilizing unmarked graves. Within an hour, word spread through Harlem like electricity through copper wire. Bumpy's back. Bumpy survived. Bumpy's untouchable. The psychological impact was seismic. He'd been thrown from a 4-story building, left to die in an alley. And 6 weeks later he was drinking bourbon in his club like nothing had happened. Like gravity was just a suggestion he'd chosen to ignore. The mythology grew with each retelling. Some said he'd landed on a pile of trash bags that broke his fall. Others said he'd grabbed a fire escape on the way down. A few claimed he'd actually died and came back through sheer willpower, a ghost with a cane and a taste for revenge. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He'd survived through preparation, loyalty, and the kind of ruthless efficiency that turned a personal attack into a city-wide purge. The Westside Boys ceased to exist, not metaphorically, actually ceased. The survivors, the ones who'd been in prison or out of town, or smart enough to not be anywhere near the 5 targets that night, took one look at the carnage and made immediate career changes. Some moved to Boston, others to Philadelphia. A few just disappeared into the American interior, changing names, burning bridges, starting over in places where nobody had heard of Red Malone or cared about Hell's Kitchen politics, the territory they'd controlled. 40 square blocks of policy operations, protection rackets, and controlled violence didn't fracture into chaos or get divided among competing interests. It simply became Harlem's, not through proclamation or treaty or negotiation, just through the understood reality that challenging Bumpy Johnson for those blocks would result in your corpse decorating a sidewalk in ways that made closed-casket funerals necessary. By December 1952, the buffer zone between 57th and 61st Street, that razor-thin neutral ground that had been contested for years, was now considered Harlem territory. Nobody tested it. Nobody even approached it. The invisible border had moved 6 blocks west, and everyone accepted this new geography like it had always been that way. Other organizations took note. The Italian families in Little Italy, who'd been eyeing Harlem's policy operations with acquisitive interest, suddenly decided their current territories were perfectly adequate. The Irish gangs in the Bronx, who'd been considering expansion, reconsidered. Even the corrupt cops who'd been on multiple payrolls decided that Bumpy's payroll was the only one that mattered if you wanted to see retirement. Because the massacre had established something that mere reputation couldn't. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just powerful. He was inevitable. You could beat him, break him, throw him out of buildings, leave him for dead in alleys. And 2 hours later, your entire organization would be erased from existence with the efficiency of a surgical strike. The new order established itself through silence, not speeches, through presence, not proclamations, through the understood reality that Harlem was now the most dangerous place in Manhattan to cause problems, and the safest place to live if you followed the rules. Policy runners paid on time, every time. Protection money was reasonable and nobody got their legs broken for being a day late. Shopkeepers could operate without fear of random shakedowns. Women could walk home at night without being dragged into alleys. Because the monster who enforced the rules was scarier than any chaos that might replace him. On Christmas Eve 1952, Bumpy Johnson stood at his office window, overlooking 125th Street, leaning on his cane, watching snow fall on his kingdom. Marcus Freeman stood beside him, silent. "They're saying you're immortal now," Marcus said finally, "that you can't be killed." Bumpy smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Let them believe that. And if someone tests it, then we remind them what happened to the last people who tested it." Marcus nodded, understanding absolute. Outside, Harlem celebrated Christmas with lights and music and the comfortable knowledge that their streets were safer than they'd been in decades, maintained by a man who'd survived the unsurvivable and punished the unpunishable. Bumpy took a sip of bourbon, felt it burn down his rebuilt throat, and thought about gravity, about how 1.7 seconds could change everything, about how dying could make you more powerful than living ever did, about how fear, when properly cultivated, was more effective than any army. He turned away from the window. "Anything else needs handling tonight?" "No, sir. Everything's quiet." "Good. Keep it that way." Marcus left. Bumpy sat at his desk, surrounded by silence and power and the invisible architecture of controlled violence that made civilization possible. A man had been thrown from a 4-story building. 2 hours later, Harlem had walked through the bloodiest war in its history, and from that night forward, nobody ever asked who Harlem belonged to. They already knew. The answer walked with a cane, drank bourbon neat, and reminded you that some men don't die when you kill them. They evolve. Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem for 16 more years after that night, dying peacefully in 1968. He never spoke about October 21st, 1952. The body spoke for him. Red Malone's name vanished from history. No gravestone, no mention of how he died. Just empty space where a man used to be. The Vanderbilt warehouse was demolished in 1955. The alley where Bumpy crawled is now a parking lot. The brownstone on 48th became luxury apartments, where residents sleep unaware 4 men burned alive beneath them. But Harlem remembers. Old-timers still whisper about the night gravity failed to kill a king, and 19 minutes redrew Manhattan's underworld forever. Power isn't about who hits hardest. It's about who gets back up. What would you have done? Fast death or orchestrate war? Drop your answer below and hit subscribe for tomorrow's episode.